the Minsk agreement is something which was always in the air, which was on the table for the last years. But of course, after the change of the new government here and after this agreement to the Steinmeier formula, it really got into the larger public. And there are other political forces who say, like, it's not working, it should be dismantled. How would you assess that? You know, from the point of view when it was, of course, it was approved, it was signed at first in autumn 2014, then in winter 2015. But what is in there the critical things? What would be your assessment of that agreement at this point of history?
Well, at first look, the conflict in eastern Ukraine continues. The special monitoring mission of the OSCE, the UN human rights monitoring missions, and others continue to report about ceasefire violations, about civilian casualties, about heavy weapons in areas where they should not be. So at first look, one might easily conclude that indeed these agreements apparently don't work. Now, it is very difficult to prove that they might have been working because you would need to prove the absence of violence. And it's very difficult to prove something that isn't there. So the absence of fighting might be a reduction of fighting, but to make that case is very difficult. So what is certainly safe to say is that these agreements have helped to contain the conflict to where it is now. Now, technically, in any armed conflict, any armed violence need to be dealt with in similar ways. You need to stop the fighting, which translates into a non-use of weapon, as it is written in the agreements, or a ceasefire by translation. You would need to make sure that the sites are not too close, because that leads unavoidably to fighting. Translated into the Minsk language, this is disengagement. You need to ensure that the weapons that reach over long distances are being pulled away to a distance where they can't reach their aim any longer, and that is, in Minsk language, the withdrawal of heavy weapons. You need to ensure the safety and security of the civilians. That means you need to demine. Also, that has found its way into the Minsk agreement. So now, whether these items are agreed in Minsk or elsewhere, they will be the same to deal with any armed violence of similar nature. Now, this, of course, leaves away the political will that is needed to implement these measures, but looking at the technical side of things, these items will be necessary in order to stop the armed violence. Once again, it is difficult to prove that they had an effect because, obviously, and the fact is that the violence continues.
But how would you, for instance, explain the fears of, if you would be an average Ukrainian coming and having the fears about the agreement, how would you could think that could be worked, explained? What do you think is missing from the explanation of the Minsk? It doesn't mean I don't ask you to argue and prove why it's the best agreement. We can agree that it's maybe definitely not perfect. But for those who are concerned, how will you explain? You think what is missing in the discussion as well?
First of all, to quote a very known person who once famously said that it's easy to start a war but very difficult to make peace. So if pulling back to where the situation was before the conflict started, if that would be easy, then we would not sit here together. So everyone has to acknowledge that the task ahead, especially after so many years, will not be an easy task. That is the first very important fact to acknowledge. It will be very difficult, and it will take difficult decisions to make sure that these technical measures to end the fighting and to stop the bloodshed will be implemented. So that, at first, is very key and important to understand.
And you mentioned about the time, so many years. On whose side the time is?
Well, it's certainly not on the time of the people of Donbas, and by extension not of the people of Ukraine, that time passes and the war and the conflict continues. I would argue that because this war doesn't divide people that have been divided by history, by language or ethnicity, the conflict itself is the dividing factor. And the longer this fighting lasts, the longer there is a contact line, the more risky it becomes that the Ukrainians on the non-government controlled side divide themselves from the Ukrainians on the government-controlled side and vice versa. And the wider this gap gets, the more difficult it will become to bring it back together. The more urgently, therefore, it is to make sure that the gap doesn't become bigger. One important measure, of course, is to try to stop the enter-fighting, because that is a key problem in this equation. The more death, the more tragedy, the more destruction, the bigger that gap becomes. But also other measures in terms of how Ukrainians in non-government controlled areas are being perceived in areas controlled by the government, and how they themselves perceive how they're welcome is of high relevance, because that will also give them the feeling as to how they will be welcomed across that gap. Therefore, once again, I do think time is not on the side of Ukrainians on both sides of the line, all over Ukraine.
And how would you explain how it exactly plays to the life of the people, this fact that the time is not on their side? What's happening? You know, you've come to Ukraine in February 2014, and you left 2018. You know, and though you are not any longer working for almost a year here in Ukraine, how did you see the development? What was the development in the non-government controlled territories, in the occupied territories in Donetsk when you've been? How these territories have been changing? We haven't been there. Many of our viewers had no chance to be there.
It allows everyone to reflect how this all has started. Now, one should not forget that in early 2014, in fact, up to summer 2014 and autumn, there was no contact line. It was very fluid. The fighting was in pockets. It was across areas. It was not really a line that was visible there. It wasn't there before. It had been created through the Minsk agreements, and is therefore an artificial line. So that line in itself is a product of this conflict. And one should not forget that there was nothing dividing these people in the sense of a contact line. There were no obstacles on the way to travel from what is now government-controlled areas to what is now non-government-controlled areas. So that is very important. Now, that meant the lives of people that use these connections on the road, on the rail, on the plane, to go to work, to see their relatives, to do business, or simply travel for pleasure, is now interrupted and has been interrupted now for many years. And this interruption, of course, has impact on their lives. One obvious impact is the security when they still do cross, and many in the thousands every day still do cross this line, which is a very important figure to consider, risk their lives when they do so. And as you know, people do still die when they do cross the line, be it out of exhaustion, of the long waiting hours exposed to the elements, or because of the security risk that they still face in these areas. But the line, that contact line and the continued fighting also causes other security risk. It causes risks of damage to the property these people live in. It causes damage to infrastructure that these civilians depend on both sides of the contact line, water, electricity, gas, just to mention a few. It has impacts further on terms of their psychology, because that continued fighting every day, non-stop, and as I've mentioned, these ceasefire violations continued unabated throughout these years, every day, and people living close to it. Their lives in non-government controlled areas and their lives in government controlled areas have taken different courses in these many years. They listen to different news, they been educated to different curriculums, they pay with different currencies, they drive cars with different number plates, they follow different cultural events on either side of the contact line, and that now for many years that creates different lives on these two sides of the contact line. There are people, of course, that still remember how it was before the war started. There are many, however, who soon will not remember any longer how it was before the conflict started. A young child that started to grow up when the conflict started was 5 or 6 in 2014, is now 11, 12 years old. That kid is about to graduate, be it on government side or non-government side, but that kid will not remember or hardly remember how it was before the conflict starts, because these formative years now, the last 6 years, will be the years that it will remember.
There is a lot of discussion that there should be good preparation. There could be like a really detailed plan or something. But it's hard to imagine like how long should it take to be prepared well to work with the conflict? Or you think it's not about just a preparation? How you see the timeline of the solution if it's there? Not everybody here also agrees that it should be resolved right now.
Well, certainly it is necessary to look into all aspects of lives in areas beyond government control and what impact this war had on them. I just mentioned a few before. These areas should be mapped out, the problems and how to deal with them should be analyzed, but that should not take that serious amount of time. What is also important is that if action is taken, and some action can be taken by Ukraine alone without having to negotiate with Moscow directly. It also requires coordination with the international community that is there also with their respective mandates to help. But what I think is equally important, that one is not in getting stuck in planning, analyzing and coordinating. It is important that actually action is being put in place so people for whom all of this should be at the end of the day realize that action had been taken to them, so that they feel that those that can make a difference to them make that difference to them, so that they feel it, that they see it, and they see a difference between now and compared with the years before.
So there is quite a huge number of people crossing the contact line these days. So is it really unusual for another types of conflicts? What makes it different? Because the Donbas is unusually large territory for any conflict we know globally of this kind, yes, especially in the post-Soviet space.
There is a lot of people still living in these areas. There's a lot of people who have connections on both sides of the contact line, because there was no line before before the war started, and we had this discussion just earlier on. If there would be a group on one side of Ukrainians and a completely different group on the other side of the contact line, one likely would not see that frequent crossing of that contact line. But because there wasn't a line before, and because there weren't two groups before on one or the other side of what is now a contact line, the people don't see each other, at least at this point, to a vast majority, otherwise the numbers would be smaller, not different. Yes, there are many of those that cross the line that do so because they claim their pension and other benefits they get only on the government-controlled side. That one should not leave out when looking at these numbers, but still looking at other conflicts where the contact line, or the front line if you wish, normally is a division line between people, normally drawn along ethnic lines, religious lines, or other lines that would define one group different from another. And I think this is the positive figure of all of the negative figures that one hears about this conflict, the figure about the people that still cross this line and want to cross this line.
How do you, with your knowledge and experience, understand this so-called Steinmeier formula? I think like many people understand it too. Though it's a short text, still many people don't get it.
Well, and a lot has still to be defined, and this is probably the reason why a lot of people still have question marks. It is a sequencing that is laid out in this formula as what needs to come in place in terms of elections and at which point in time these different elements will come together, but under which circumstances and where in the bigger picture this formula will be plugged in, that is not stipulated in that formula, and that requires still further discussion.
So what do you think is exactly requiring the further discussion? I think that the major question people have, would there be any kind of people with the guns, troops in times of the elections? Though of course OSCE would say like, no, if there are other people with the weapon, you can't recognize these elections. But that's not really clear there.
Well, one thing has to be absolutely clear, I do think, is that if you have howitzers, tanks, multiple launch rocket systems still standing in areas where they can be used, if you still register up to 1,000 ceasefire violations a day at the contact line, as the special monitoring mission of the OSCE does per day, if you still register civilian casualties at the contact line as a cause of the ongoing fighting, as reported by the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, it is clear that there is an active conflict ongoing. They require full implementation and verified implementation so that it can be made sure before any other process starts that the weapons are gone away and stay away, that armed men are gone away and stay away, and that people who move about and go about can do so safely. That applies both to civilians but also to any international organization that would need to operate in that area.
I think what also people are struggling, they don't imagine how all of a sudden the weapon isn't there. You know, like all of a sudden Russia or the separatists, they just like withdraw. How it should look like, how this demilitarization takes place. Because when you don't have a picture in your mind, it looks impossible.
And the first important phase is there needs to be a silence at the contact line. The ceasefire has to be the starting point. And as happened now at Stanica Luhansk or Solote, if the sides go further away from one another, the risk that the fighting starts is significantly reduced. That only, however, is also only possible and sustainable if heavy weapons that often far behind these areas are being withdrawn and remain withdrawn. And the only way to make sure that sides actually disengage and that weapons remain withdrawn is that you have a third entity to verify, not just to monitor, but to verify that these weapons have been withdrawn and remain withdrawn. And for that verification process, you require cooperation with the sides. And a straightforward issue to be resolved there is that the sides would need to hand down to the verifier a list of equipment that they have to withdraw so that the verifier can go to an area and say, yes, this tank is now here and the next day is here. And this tank needs to be in an area where the verifier has unhindered access, and that area needs to be permanently surveyed, for instance, with electronic means or physically by having the verifier being permanently located there. At that point, it can be verified that that tank is not any longer on the battlefield or leaves in the night and fires and goes back in the morning, but remains there and stays there. And only then you can speak about verification. And the verification of withdrawal of armaments is a basis, not the only, but it's a basis to build trust between the sides. Because if one side sees through the third party that weapons have been withdrawn and remain verifiably withdrawn, only then they will be assured that if they do the same, that they will not be betrayed or the other side will take advantage. So that has to be a mirror-like move on both sides of the contact line. Unilateral moves in this regard will be unhelpful, they will not work.
Is it realistic from also the past experience that this happens or these kind of simultaneous actions are doable?
Yeah, these technical measures have been tested in other conflicts as well. Wherever you have small arms and heavy arms engaged, you have positions too close, you have, it's a natural thing, so you have to take the fighting sides away from another, that they can't reach each other with the small arms. And you need to take weapons that have a long reach when you fire them. You need to take them so far away that they, even if they fight, they can't reach the other side any longer. And you need to park them in an area where they're not being taken out any longer in the night, quietly put to the front, been fired and put back again in the morning. And this happened elsewhere. That is not unique. What is being prescribed in the Minsk agreements. It happened in other armed conflict around the world.
Does the OSCE SMM mission has the mandate and capacity to do that in case there is a political will? Billy, maybe you can explain from your previous experience.
I do believe that a third entity, be it the OSCE, the UN, anyone else, is likely required to assist that process. So you have one from one side, one from the other side, and the third entity, normally an international officer, that then make sure that the verification on either side of the contact line is done by the three together so that no one can argue against the other. That's in the best case, where you have these military commissions, joint military commissions elsewhere. And if anything, in the Minsk agreements, the mechanism through which non-adherence to the agreements can be followed up is missing, and this is a point where I believe Minsk has a deficit, because there is no mechanism through which violations of the agreements can be pursued. There is no follow-up, there is no consequence if there is a ceasefire violation, if a person dies, if a house is destroyed, if a bridge is blown up, if a field is mined, if a tank is where it shouldn't be. There are no consequences, not for the troops on the ground and not for the politician endorsing or not reversing it. No political costs attached. And that has to change. So the accountability mechanism, or the lack of an accountability mechanism within that Minsk framework, is a significant deficit that needs to be overcome. And that is certainly something I would encourage everyone that is involved in this process to consider, because that will help to end the impunity with which, at this point in time, these agreements are still being violated.
Do you think this accountability helps in the moment when, the discussion on this accountability, in the moment where anyway the side's trying to build any agreement on anything?
It's one puzzle piece that is required. It is not the silver bullet that will bring this to a conclusion. Once again, I'm not naive to assume that all these technical arrangements will sort out this conflict. No, political will in the end will. And likely only political will. But meanwhile, those directly engaged and responsible should make sure that they build up the capacity, that they're ready to actually implement these technical measures once that political will is being materialized.
Can you explain why we are speaking now about Zolote, Petrivske, Stanica, because there is such a long contact line. So why is it just these villages and these territories in the agreement, and how much is it out of the whole contact line, of the whole territory where the troops are?
Well, first of all, the disengagement at Stanica Luhanska, to take this as an example, was very important and proven, at least to this day, as being a rather successful process. It helped not only to reduce the fighting in that area, it helped to demine the area, it helped to rebuild the bridge, it helped to allow the people to cross that part of the contact line more easily. If there would have been no disengagement, all of that would not have happened. So clearly, disengagement work if there is political will to it. Now, Zolote is also a potential crossing point. Also there it makes sense, because if you want to have this as a crossing point, it will not work if it is militarized, therefore moving people away. That, of course, will also be helpful. Then eventually, once that will be a crossing point, that this will then be one to safely cross. Now, all the three areas that now had been disengaged, counting together, are roughly at the length of 3-4 kilometers, so there's less than 1% of the entire contact line, if you take the number of 480 kilometers of all the line, depending on how you measure it. So there's much more to disengage, obviously, all along that line, and that the fighting continues is not least a result of the fact that in many areas along the contact line, the sites are simply far too close pitched at one another, very close across the road, a few meters only dividing them, and that's a recipe for more tension and a recipe for more fighting.
But it looks like with these 3 kilometers overall, it's just like a very, very tiny bit of the whole.
Yes, it is less than a percentage, so 99% still need to be done. But what it shows is that it can work. And what it also shows, what is probably even more important, that it will serve the people. It will help people to feel more safe, to have more freedom of movement, to be able to cross the contact line in a more relaxed, less tense area where they have to cross through armed men and mined fields and what have you. That, I think, is very important. It shows that disengagement is one tool of many Again, it's not the only silver bullet, but one tool that can help to calm down the situation, to ease the fighting, combine it with demining, with verified withdrawal of heavy weapons, and with other measures foreseen in Minsk, you will be able then to stabilize and effectively install a ceasefire that is sustainable, not just holding a few hours or a few days, but sustainably it is a resilient ceasefire because the sites are too far away to start fighting, the heavy weapons are parked away so that they can't be used any longer. The mines are gone, they're not able to hurt anyone any longer, and you have it all verified. At that point, you have a resilient, sustainable ceasefire, and that is what I think, and I would suggest that implementing these measures should be aiming at.
You spent, you've come, I wonder how many times to the non-government controlled Donbas. Did you understand how I know the time has passed since you are not any longer officially employed by the OSCE SMM, but the mood of the people was, I'm speaking about the civilians, of course.
Well, as you have just said, for yourself, the OSCE for itself, and I for myself, I believe there was never a poll taken to have a very broad and deep insight as to what people are thinking. Now, that aside, anecdotally, indeed, people throughout the years told me quite often the same. And it didn't matter on which side of the contact line you would ask the question. And the first thing people would say is they would like to have an end to the fighting. They say also it is not their war, it's someone else's war, but not their war. Again, an indication that it's not people against people. It is not a group-driven conflict. They also say they don't understand why it is continuing, meaning in their view, from their own assessment, there had been no reason why this is continuing. And again, indication that they had no disgruntlement against Ukrainians on the other side, and that on both sides of the contact line. I have also met many civilians, non-affiliated to the armed formations in non-government controlled areas, that would clearly say that they feel as Ukrainians. When you ask them, of course, how this should be arranged in a post-conflict time, you will get all kinds of different answers in terms of how the political arrangement should be looking like. But in terms of their identification as to where they feel belong to, I think there was quite a uniform response by the normal civilian that you would meet in the street. People even would communicate in Ukrainian in the streets of Donetsk when that was necessary, and that's so in the presence of armed men. So I do feel that people are not necessarily reflecting as to what the news is reflecting they're hearing in non-government controlled areas. Whether that is still now the case after a year I've left, I can't judge, but at the time it at least appeared to me that the conflict that the people see in front of their eyes every day for many years now, they clearly see and say and told that it is not theirs.
We currently, it was announced that there might be the meeting between the President Putin and President Zelensky. That would be the first since many years and the first of new Ukrainian leader. Already in December, many says, Ukrainian president should be very well prepared for that meeting. There should be, but we really don't understand what should be exactly prepared. Do we expect the plan? I understand it's not in your knowledge to know, but if you're a specialist, you think what they can come out of this kind of meeting, because nobody else would. We understand that they won't come and say yeah, that's the peace. You don't expect that, but what can come out of this discussion? Because there are some very high expectations, but also there are people who say it's useless anyways to meet.
Well, I would start with the expectations. So one thing, it is important to make clear to everyone that this war, this conflict cannot be resolved with a single meeting. It will take more than that. But at the same time, without talking, without the dialogue of some sort, it will take even longer. So I would encourage any dialogue that would aim at a peaceful resolution of this war. But it is important to make clear to the public here and internationally that one goes realistically into such meetings so that one is clear from the very beginning that this is not a one-stop event, but one of many more to come. A lot has happened in the past 5 or 6 years soon, and that requires a lot of more discussion for it all to be sorted out. Ukraine shares a 2,000-kilometer border with Russia. For me, it is important that the two nations talk to one another, but it should be at equal and unequal footing, and it should aim at resolving that situation in eastern Ukraine peacefully.
But for you, for instance, you would definitely follow, even if you don't work, you will follow. What do you think there are this kind of a minimum, a humble minimum of the realistic progress?
Well, I think a genuine discussion between these two presidents, it does not need to be public, but a discussion that is not driven by accusation from either or the other side, but a discussion on substance, I think is required, and many more are required so that the facts on the ground can be discussed and not allegations being traded in these meetings. So I think it should be a fact-based discussion aimed at resolving the conflict, the war, peacefully.
But you know what anybody would say, that there is, in this conflict, there is a clear, for Ukrainians, for many Ukrainians aggressor, the conflict is taking place in the Ukrainian soil, and for many Ukrainians, it's clear that, it's not Ukrainian government who started the war. So they also want kind of to hear that argument, that the president has this argument. Or you think at this stage of the conflict it's obvious that there is no way that the president don't really discuss it? Or
well,
just...
it is obvious, and it has never been different, and it's documented by a signature of Russia on the Minsk agreement that Russia is part of this conflict. So there is no doubt about that. The signature itself makes it very clear. Whatever you call them that part, but it is part to that conflict and has a responsibility which has it taken on itself by signing these agreements. So I think that is clear. What is also clear is that finger-pointing across the border from both sides over the past 5 or 6 years has not brought this any further. It has brought it into a stalemate, and it should be a fact-based discussion and been looking at the stipulated arrangements that had been made in the course of the years which have been aimed, when you read these documents, at reducing and ending the fighting and making sure that the territorial sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine is reestablished. That should be the aim, and that has to be the aim of this discussion.
Alexander, you've been working in different conflicts. How, globally, how do you see this one? A lot of Ukrainians would say that, and a lot of people think that their conflict is unique. In some ways, it's probably unique because there is also the proxy war here. How do you see it, like, overall?
Well,
from your previous experience as well.
My own experiences of conflict and war compared to the war here in Ukraine is that the others have been largely, not only, but largely driven by ethnic, religious differences and division. They also had a political component, of course, but whereas here, the people on the ground had nothing to do and still are not part of the conflict itself. They may be drawn into it, they may be suffering from it, but the ethnic conflict type, religious conflict type that I have witnessed elsewhere cannot be found here. And I think this, again, is the big difference, and it's also the opportunity to resolve this differently than other conflicts. So there is no group dynamic evolving. What is the same, however, in all of the conflicts I have seen, is the suffering of the civilian people, no matter whether it's a politically driven conflict like here, ethnically or religiously, where civilians suffer most. Because unlike the people with arms and guns, civilians are not protected. They're not in the trenches, they're not in armed vehicles, they're in their gardens, in their kitchens, and are not protected. And that is the same elsewhere.
What makes you, after your work, let's say, also disappointed about the conflict, but as well also hopeful?
Well, hopeful first. I'm hopeful because I can see that there is a lot of discussion and debate about this conflict in Ukraine. Some of these discussions are helpful, some not. But eventually, only debate and discussion will resolve this conflict. Only dialogue will resolve and can resolve this conflict. The fact that people at the contact line continue to cross the line is also a very positive light, and I've mentioned that a couple of times now. This you don't see elsewhere. This should be the motivation of making sure that there is no division and the motivation to stop the fighting, because in the end, this all should be for the people that live there, for the people that live in Donbas, so they get back their normal lives. What would be the Donbas without its people? That doesn't make any sense. So any action should aim at making sure that people that suffer from this conflict have an end and see an end to that suffering. Now, disappointing, of course, is that I know very well that with all good intentions of the civil society, of the people on the ground, the international community, the government in Kiev, if there is no political will, and that mainly, not only, but mainly needs to materialize in Moscow, to some degree also here in Kiev, this conflict will not be resolved and has not been resolved. And it's the key to make sure that what has been written into Minsk and what is required to end the bloodshed is being implemented. That political will has disregarded the people on the ground. If the politicians that make the decisions to continue the fight and not to implement what they have agreed would think of what consequences it has to the people on the ground they often claim they protect, then I'm sure the situation now would be different. So that is disappointing, of course, to see still not happening, but I'm convinced that it is still possible to end this, and I know the only way to do so is peacefully.